In this video, we are going to understand the difference between gauge pressure and absolute pressure. If you look at your AC unit's data book, or sometimes even inside the unit, you'll see two pressure readings, PSIG and PSIA. PSIG means pounds per square inch gauge, that's the gauge pressure. PSIA means pounds per square inch absolute, that's the absolute pressure. The atmospheric pressure around us is 14.7 psi. But when we connect a manifold gauge in open air, it doesn't show 14.7 psi, it shows 0 psi. That's because the gauge considers atmospheric pressure as 0. So, when a measurement includes the atmospheric pressure, we call it absolute pressure. And when it ignores atmospheric pressure, we call it gauge pressure. Let's take an outdoor AC unit as an example. There's no refrigerant inside, only air at normal atmospheric pressure, which is 14.7 psi absolute. Now, if we check the pressure using a manifold gauge, it'll still show 0 psi. Even though the actual pressure inside the unit is 14.7 psi, the gauge reads 0 because it treats atmospheric pressure as 0 reference. To understand this better, let's see a few more readings. If the system pressure is 29.4 psi absolute, the gauge will show 14.7 psi. If the system pressure is 44.1 psi absolute, the gauge will show 29.4 psi. If the system pressure is 0 psi absolute, the gauge will show minus 14.7 psi, which is vacuum. So, you can see, every time we add or remove 14.7 psi, it shifts between absolute and gauge pressure readings. Now, let's take the same outdoor unit again. There's no refrigerant inside it. When we check the pressure using a vacuum gauge or Micron gauge, it shows 14.7 psi because a vacuum gauge measures absolute pressure. When we perform vacuuming, we are actually reducing the pressure inside the unit below atmospheric pressure. That means we are pulling the air out of the system until the pressure becomes much lower than 14.7 psi. In HVAC, we usually pull the vacuum down to about 500 microns, which is equal to 0.0097 psia. Because vacuuming needs us to measure a pressure lower than the atmosphere, we must use an instrument that measures absolute pressure, not gauge pressure. That's why the manifold gauge is not suitable for vacuuming. It can show only rough vacuum values up to minus 30 inches of mercury, but to know the exact deep vacuum, we must use a Micron gauge. That's why we say gauge pressure equals pressure measured with atmospheric pressure as 0. And absolute pressure equals gauge pressure plus atmospheric pressure. In HVAC, we always use gauge pressure for refrigerant charging and system checks, and absolute pressure when measuring deep vacuum using a Micron gauge. So remember, atmospheric pressure is 14.7 psi. Gauge pressure treats it as 0, while absolute pressure includes it. That's the key difference between PSIG and PSIA.